She heard it before anyone else did. That small, metallic sound, barely a whisper beneath the noise of the crowded restaurant. A sound most people would never recognize. But Mara recognized it. She had grown up with that sound. She had lost someone to that sound. And in the half-second between hearing it and understanding it, her entire body moved before her mind gave the order. The tray left her hands, her body turned, and she threw herself in front of Dante Voss. The shot cracked through the air like the world splitting open. Glass shattered somewhere behind her. A woman screamed, then another. The entire restaurant dissolved into chaos, chairs scraping, bodies dropping to the floor, the clatter of silverware raining down like broken music. But Mara didn't fall. She stood completely still, her back pressed against the chest of the most dangerous man in the city. Her arms spread slightly outward as if she could shield him from the entire room with nothing. But her body and her will. Dante Voss did not move either. For 3 full seconds, neither of them breathed. Then his voice came, low, controlled, almost impossibly calm for a man who had just nearly been killed. Move, she didn't. I said move. There's a second shooter, she said quietly. Northeast corner. He hasn't fired yet. If you stand up right now, he will. Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Around them his men were already in motion, black suits converging, weapons drawn, voices clipped and urgent in Italian and English. Someone was shouting into a phone. Someone else was dragging a body toward the exit. The restaurant had become a battlefield in the space of 10 seconds, and yet the two of them remained in the center of it, like the eye of a storm. Still locked, breathing the same air, Dante Voss had not survived 40. 2 years, 3 assassination attempts, and the brutal architecture of the Voss crime empire by being slow. But he was slow now, slower than he had ever been, because the woman pressed against him, this waitress, this nobody, this girl in a white shirt and black apron, had just saved his life. And she was not trembling. She was not trembling at all. His hand came up slowly and closed around her wrist. Not roughly, not gently, simply, firmly, as if taking inventory of something unexpected. "Who are you?" he said against her ear. She didn't answer. Across the room there was a crash, a shout, and then a single gunshot, controlled, precise as one of Dante's men, neutralized the second shooter with the efficiency of someone swatting a fly. The threat collapsed, the room exhaled, and slowly, like a tide pulling back from shore, the immediate danger receded. Dante's grip on her wrist did not loosen. He turned her, not forcefully, but there was no question that it was a turn he had decided on, and her cooperation was a courtesy he was not especially interested in. He turned her to face him, and for the first time he looked at her, really looked. She met his gaze without flinching. Dark eyes, steady, a jaw set with the particular tension of someone who was holding something in. Not fear, but something older than fear. Something shaped by loss and hardened by time. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s perhaps. A small scar at the edge of her left brow that she'd stopped trying to hide. Hands that were too still for someone who had just thrown themselves into the path of a bullet. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked down. A thin line of red was tracing itself along her forearm. A graze, nothing more, but real enough. She looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a dent in a table. Acknowledged, filed away, unimportant. "I'll get a bandage from the back," she said. She turned to walk away. "You will not," he said. She stopped. The restaurant was still in chaos around them, his men sweeping the perimeter, staff huddled in corners. The distant sound of sirens beginning to bloom in the night air outside. And in the middle of all of it, a waitress and a crime lord stood 3 feet apart, and she looked at him with those unreadable eyes, and he looked at her as if he had never seen anything quite like her before in his life, which he hadn't. "Sit down," he said. "I have tables to sit down." She sat. The Veller was not the kind of restaurant where ordinary people ate. It occupied the entire 43rd floor of the Crestline Tower, its windows a seamless panorama of the city sprawled below like a circuit board of light and ambition. The tables were spaced far apart, deliberately, architecturally, so that the conversations happening at each one could remain private. The lighting was amber and low, the menus had no prices, the staff wore white and moved like ghosts, present when needed, invisible when not. It was the kind of place that existed to make powerful men feel safe, which was precisely why it had been chosen for the attempt. Dante Voss came to the Veller on the last Thursday of every month. This was known. His routines were few, but this one was documented. His table in the northwest corner, his back to the wall, his preferred wine poured before he arrived. It was the kind of information that took months to acquire, months of patience, months of watching. And someone had been that patient. He sat now at that same corner table, two of his men standing at discreet but immovable distances, and he watched the waitress press a folded cloth napkin against the graze on her arm with the calm efficiency of someone who had done something like this before. She hadn't given him her name yet. He hadn't asked again. He would not ask again. He never asked twice for anything, and yet he was still watching her. There were things about Dante Voss that his enemies knew and things they did not. They knew his empire. They knew the businesses, the shipping routes, the construction firms, the real estate holdings that spread through the city like roots. They knew the reputation, that he did not negotiate under duress, that he did not forgive betrayal, that the men who had tried to take from him had uniformly found the experience fatal. They knew the surface of him, the tailored suits, the controlled voice, the face that gave nothing away. What they did not know was that he had spent most of his life waiting to feel something, not consciously, not in any way he would ever have articulated or admitted or allowed himself to recognize. But it was there beneath the architecture of his control, beneath the machinery of the empire. There was something hollow that had been there so long he had simply accepted it as a feature of his existence, like the hum of a building's infrastructure, always present, never examined. He had been in this business since he was 19 years old. He had buried his father when he was 24, taken the reins of the Voss operation when the blood was still fresh on his hands, and had not looked back once in the 18 years since. He had learned to sleep lightly and trust no one. He had learned that softness was a liability and sentiment was a weapon that enemies used against you. He had learned these lessons with a thoroughness that left no room for exceptions. And then a waitress had heard a trigger click and put her body between him and a bullet. He picked up his wine glass, set it down without drinking. "Your arm needs to be looked at properly," he said. "It's fine. I didn't ask if it was fine." She looked up at him. There was no hostility in her expression, but no deference either. Just that steady measuring quality, as if she were constantly calculating distances. "My name is Mara Sorrel," she said. It wasn't an answer to anything he'd said. It was a correction of his assumption that she would remain nameless in his presence. "I've worked here for 8 months. I'm not a threat to you." "I know you're not," he said. "If I thought you were a threat, this conversation would be happening somewhere considerably less pleasant." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not fear, recognition, perhaps, of a world she knew existed, had always known existed, but had chosen to stand near anyway. "Then what do you want?" she asked. He considered the question. It was, he realized, an unusually direct thing to ask him. Most people in her position, most people in any position, did not ask Dante Voss what he wanted. They waited. They inferred. They tried to anticipate. The boldness of a direct question from a woman who had every reason to be scrambling for exits should have irritated him. "It didn't, to understand," he said, "how a waitress knows what a trigger click sounds like." The silence that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. Mara set down the napkin. She looked at her arm. The bleeding had slowed to almost nothing, the graze already darkening at its edges. She pressed her lips together briefly in an expression he couldn't quite name. "I grew up in Callaway District," she said. He understood immediately. Callaway District, the southeastern edge of the city, where 3 territories overlapped and no one could agree on the boundaries, where children learned to recognize certain sounds, the way other children learned to recognize birdsong. where losing someone to those sounds was not a tragedy so much as a statistical probability. He said nothing. She said nothing. The city glittered 3 floors below them, indifferent and brilliant. His name among his men was simply Il Dieter, the director. Not because he directed them in any hands. On operational sense, he was far past that, had been for years, but because everything in the Voss organization moved according to his design, his tempo, his will. He sat at the center of it, the way a spider sits at the center of a web, motionless, invisible, and catastrophically present. He had never married. There had been women, there had always been women, the kind who were drawn to that particular gravity of power and danger like moths to a flame that would absolutely destroy them. But none of them had lasted, not because he had been cruel to them particularly, simply because at some point each of them had realized, with varying degrees of grief, that there was a part of him they could not reach, and that part was not small. His second in command was a man named Ren Calais, compact, watchful, with the eyes of someone who has spent years observing human behavior and drawing conclusions that he rarely shares. Ren had been with Dante since they were teenagers sharing the same corner of Callaway District, before either of them had understood what they were becoming. There was no one on earth whose read of Dante Voss was more precise, and Ren was watching his boss watch the waitress with an expression he had never seen before. Not desire, though there was something in that direction, something he filed and set aside, but this was more specific than desire. This was the look of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for, something that sat outside his taxonomies of the world. And Dante, who had a category for everything, was sitting very still as a result. Later, outside the building, while Dante's car idled at the curb and the police were still inside taking statements from staff who would remember nothing useful, Ren stood beside him and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "She saved your life. Yes. Do we know who she is?" Mara Sorrell, 8 months at the Veller, before that, 3 years at a bar in Middleton District, before that, a stint as an emergency medical technician. A pause. She left that field after her brother was killed on a call. Ren was quiet. Callaway District. Dante added. "Ah," said Ren. That single syllable contained a great deal. Dante looked out at the street, at the lights blurring in the wet pavement, at the city doing what it always did, which was continuing relentlessly regardless of what happened inside it. "Find out who sent the shooters," he said, already working on it. "And Ren," he paused, "have someone check on her tomorrow, quietly. Make sure she's not being watched." Ren looked at him. Dante got in the car. The door closed. The car pulled into traffic. And Ren stood on the sidewalk in the amber-lit night, watching the taillights disappear, feeling something that in all his years beside this man he had never felt before. Surprise, Mara walked home. She always walked home from the late shift, 40 minutes through streets that most women wouldn't have chosen. But she had never been most women. She wore her coat pulled close, and her footsteps were measured and deliberate, and she moved through the dark streets with the particular quality of someone who has learned that danger is real, also manageable, and that the best response to it is not fear but attention. Her arm ached. She'd let one of Dante's men wrap it properly before she left, a quiet, careful man who had done it without speaking, which she appreciated. The graze was minor. She'd had worse. She'd seen much worse. She was not thinking about the shooting. She was thinking about his eyes. She hadn't expected that. She had expected what? The cold assessment she'd heard about. The impersonal calculation of a man who treated human beings as variables in an equation. She'd expected to be questioned, processed, dismissed. Maybe paid, maybe threatened. The rumors about Dante Voss were not benign, but she hadn't expected that particular quality of attention. The way he'd looked at her, as if she'd said something in a language he'd forgotten, he knew. The way he'd sat completely still, not the stillness of danger, but the stillness of something trying to understand itself. She turned onto her block, the familiar row of narrow buildings, the corner store with its perpetual lit sign, the smell of rain and pavement and someone's dinner drifting from a window above. She stopped at her door, fished out her keys, and then went very still, because there was someone standing in the shadow at the end of the block. Not threatening, not approaching, just present, watching. She looked for a long moment, her heart steady, her hands on her keys. The figure didn't move. She went inside. She locked the door. She leaned against it in the dark for a moment, her eyes closed, her breath controlled. In her chest, something she had kept carefully locked for years shifted slightly, almost invisibly. Like a sleeping thing turning over, she opened her eyes. "Stop it," she said quietly to no one. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. She did not expect to see him again. That was what she told herself the next morning, standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching the street below with the particular neutrality of someone who is absolutely not watching the street below. The figure from the night before was gone. Of course it was gone. She had probably imagined the specificity of it, the deliberate stillness, the sense of being observed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had probably projected. She was good at projecting. Her therapist had told her that once, before she'd stopped going to therapy, before she decided that the money was better, spent on rent, and the silence of her own apartment was more honest than the careful questions of a stranger. She drank her cold coffee, she got dressed, she went to work. The Veller was different in the daytime. She had never worked the lunch service before. Her shifts were always evenings, always that amber, lit world of whispered conversations and expensive wine. But the manager had called her in morning and told her, with a careful neutrality that communicated more than his words, that her schedule was being adjusted temporarily. She hadn't asked why, she understood why. The restaurant was a crime scene that had been very efficiently made to look like nothing had happened, and the staff who had witnessed the shooting were being quietly redistributed until the official version of events, a gas leak, a faulty pipe, a perfectly mundane explanation that would satisfy insurance companies and city officials, had time to settle into the public record. She tied her apron and went to her section. By noon, she had almost convinced herself the previous night was a story that had happened to someone else. Then Marco appeared. She recognized him, one of the men who had been at the table with Dante, one of the black, suited quiet ones who had moved through the chaos with such practiced efficiency. He was not in a suit today. He wore a plain jacket, carried a paper bag, and sat at the bar with the practiced casualness of someone doing a very poor impression of being casual. He waited until she came to take his order. He asked for coffee, black, and when she set it down, he slid a card beneath the saucer without looking at her. She didn't look at it either. She walked to the back. She stood in the corridor outside the kitchen for a moment. The sounds of the lunch service, clinking glasses, the chef calling orders, a busboy singing quietly to himself, washing around her like something ordinary and dear. She reached into her apron pocket and turned the card over. It was thick cardstock cream, colored with nothing on it except a phone number in clean black type, and beneath it 2 words. "Thank you." She stared at it. Then she put it back in her pocket, picked up her tray, and went back to her tables. Marco finished his coffee, left a tip that was aggressively, almost comically large, and walked out without looking at her again. She worked the entire rest of her shift without deciding what to do about the card. She called the number at 9:15 that evening. She had told herself she wasn't going to. She had constructed a very reasonable argument about why involvement with Dante Voss, any involvement, however tangential, however well-intentioned, was the kind of decision that people made once and spent a long time regretting. She knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who he was. The Voss name was not a name you stepped toward voluntarily. And yet, she stood in her kitchen, card in hand, and dialed. It rang twice. MS Sorrel. His voice was the same as she remembered, low, unhurried, calibrated to a frequency that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere deeper. "I wasn't sure you'd call. I wasn't sure either," she said honestly. A pause. Not an uncomfortable pause, more like the pause of someone adjusting to a person who speaks plainly. "How is your arm?" "Fine. You're going to keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Another pause. She had the sense, strange and specific, of someone smiling without smiling, some internal acknowledgement that didn't reach the surface. "I'd like to speak with you," he said in person tomorrow evening. She looked at the window, the street below, the ordinary life of it. "About what?" she asked. "About what you heard last night, and what you knew to do about it. I already told you. I grew up in Callaway District." "Yes," he said. "You did, and I'd like to understand that better." There was something in his voice, not a demand, not quite. More like the careful approach of someone trying not to startle a creature they've never encountered before. It was not at all what she'd expected from the man she'd been told about. "Why?" she asked. He said nothing for a moment. Then, because in 18 years of this work, I have never had anyone step in front of a bullet for me who wasn't paid to, and you weren't paid to. The honesty of it landed differently than she'd expected, clean, unadorned, like a fact being placed on a table between them. She ran her thumb along the edge of the card. "Tomorrow evening," she said. "Where?" "He sent a car." Of course he sent a car. She had known he would send a car. She had dressed for an environment considerably more formal than her own apartment, worn the dark green dress that her friend Lena had once told her made her look like someone who didn't take any nonsense from anyone, and she had stood on the curb at 7:45 and watched the black car arrive with the calm of someone who has already made peace with a decision. The driver, not Marco, a different man, older, with the face of someone who had seen a great many things and formed opinions about none of them, did not speak during the drive. She did not encourage it. She watched the city pass outside the window and turned what she knew about herself over in her mind like stones, checking their weight. She knew she was not afraid of Dante Voss. This was perhaps a character flaw. Her brother Illy would have said it was a character flaw. Illy, who had understood fear with a precision that came from never being able to afford its absence, who had known the exact shape of every threat in their neighborhood, and had navigated them with a grace that had still not been enough to save him. Illy would have said, "Mara, you have always confused bravery with not caring enough about your own safety." She pressed her hand flat against her knee, breathed. The car stopped outside a building she recognized, one of the Voss properties, a converted warehouse on the east side that had become, over the past decade, a genuinely beautiful space. She had read about it in a magazine once, in a dentist's waiting room. The article had been about architecture. It had not mentioned who owned it. She got out. The entrance was understated. A wide door, a man who opened it without speaking, a corridor that smelled of wood and cool air, and then a room that opened up with the unexpected drama of a held breath, released, high ceilings, exposed beams, a long wall of windows looking out over the river. A single table set for two, lit by candles and the ambient glow of the city beyond the glass. He was already there. He stood at the window with his back to her, looking out at the river. He wore dark clothing, not a suit tonight, but something that occupied the same gravitational field as a suit. He held nothing in his hands. He wasn't performing thought or contemplation. He simply was, the way a piece of architecture simply is, present, definitive, unapologetic about taking up space. He heard her enter. She knew he heard her. There was a fractional change in his posture, the smallest possible acknowledgement. But he didn't turn immediately. She stood at the edge of the room and waited. When he turned, it was unhurried. He looked at her at the same inventory she'd felt at the restaurant, but quieter now, without the noise of chaos around it. More deliberate. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say many things. I mean what I say." He studied her for a moment. Then he gestured toward the table, and she crossed the room and sat, and he sat across from her, and the candles made small, trembling circles of light between them. "You look different," he said, "from a hostage situation. From someone waiting tables in a restaurant that nearly got shot up." "I'm the same person," she said. Different apron. Something moved through his expression, there and gone, so quickly she wasn't sure she'd seen it. Not quite amusement, the ghost of amusement, the memory of a reflex, A man appeared, white jacket, the quiet efficiency of train service, and poured wine without being asked. Then vanished. Dante looked at the glass but didn't lift it. "Tell me about Callaway District," he said. "Tell me what you already know," she said, "and I'll tell you what you got wrong." The silence that followed was different from the silences at the restaurant. That had been the silence of danger and shock and two people in the immediate aftermath of near death. This was something else. This was the silence of two people in a room together, a table between them and a long evening ahead, recognizing that they were both fluent in a language that most of the world didn't speak, the language of loss, of knowing exactly what it costs. "Your brother," he said. She went very still. Not with fear, not with anger, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to receive the thing they always knew was coming. "His name was Ali," she said. "He was 27. He was the best person I've ever known." She paused. "And he died on a Tuesday afternoon because someone made a call that shouldn't have been made, and the response time was wrong, and the situation was what it was." She lifted her wine glass. "His name was Ali Sorrel, and he deserved better. That's what I know about Callaway District." Dante looked at her. The candles moved. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, plain. And she understood, watching him say them, that he did not say them often, not because he lacked the capacity, but because in his world, sorrow was something you folded away where it couldn't be used against you. The fact that he had said them at all was a thing that sat in the air between them with a specific weight. She nodded once, accepting, not forgiving. There was nothing to forgive but accepting. "I became an EMT because of him," she said. "I left because of him too. After he died, I couldn't." She stopped, started again. "I couldn't go back to that particular shape of helplessness, so I left. And ended up serving wine to men like me. The tips are better," she said. This time the ghost of amusement became something more concrete. A shift around his eyes, the faintest trace of a line at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the infrastructure of one. She felt something shift in her chest that she immediately, firmly relocated. "The shooter last night," she said. "You know who sent him." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. The trace of warmth receded. What replaced it wasn't coldness exactly, more like a door closing in a controlled, considered way. "That," he said, "is not your concern. I have a graze on my arm that says otherwise. You have a graze on your arm," he said, his voice perfectly even, "because you made a choice that was not asked of you. That choice is mine to address. It is not yours to carry. I'm not trying to carry it," she said. "I just want to know that it's being addressed." He looked at her for a long moment. "It's being addressed," he said. She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. And strangely, unreasonably, perhaps she believed him, they ate. He asked her questions, and she answered them mostly. And she asked him questions, and he answered some of them. And the ones he didn't answer, he deflected with a precision that was almost elegant, turning the conversation back to her with the practiced ease of someone who was very rarely the one being turned toward. She noticed this. She also noticed the way he watched her when she spoke. Not predatorily, not with the particular attention of a man deciding what he wants. With something more careful, more surprised, the attention of someone encountering something unexpected in a place they had stopped expecting surprises. She did not let herself feel flattered by this. She had her own discipline, but she noticed it. By the time the dessert she hadn't ordered arrived and she ate it anyway because it was extraordinary, the evening had become a thing with its own atmosphere, warm, carefully maintained, suspended slightly outside the normal laws of their separate lives. The city moved outside the windows. The river caught the light. The candles burned lower. "Why did you really ask me here?" she said. He considered the question. "I told you," he said. "You told me a reason," she said. "I'm asking about the real one." The silence stretched. He looked at the window. At the river, at his hands briefly, in a gesture she suspected he was unaware of. "You weren't afraid of me," he said finally. She waited. "Everyone is afraid of me," he said, in varying degrees and for varying reasons, but the baseline is consistent. He said it without pride and without complaint, simply as a fact, the way one states whether, and you weren't, you aren't, and I find that, he stopped. Interesting, she offered. He looked at her. Unsettling, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached for her wine. Good, she said. And across the table, in the candlelight, with the city burning quietly outside and the weight of both their histories sitting between them like a third guest neither of them had invited, something happened in Dante Voss's expression that he would have prevented if he'd been fast enough. He wasn't fast enough. For just a moment, brief, unguarded, real, he looked at her with something that was not coldness and not calculation, and not the controlled remove of a man who had armored himself against feeling. He looked at her like someone waking up after a very long time asleep, and then it was gone, the door closed. The composure returned. He set down his glass and said it was late and the car would take her home, and she nodded and stood and thanked him for the evening without any of the deference he was accustomed to and walked to the door. She was almost through it when he spoke. Ms. Sorrel, she turned. He was still at the table, one hand resting on the white cloth, watching her. Don't walk home, he said. Take the car. She looked at him. I always walk home, she said. I know, he said. Don't. The weight of what he wasn't saying sat clearly in the air between them. She walked back to the table. She picked up the card that the driver had left earlier, that she'd placed beside her wine glass and forgotten. She turned it over. If I need to walk home, she said, I'll call first. She left. In the car which she took because she was practical and it was late and some battles were not worth fighting. She looked out at the city and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, feeling the displaced thing she had relocated earlier in the evening. It had moved again. She pressed harder. It didn't move back. 3 days passed. She didn't call. He didn't send the car. The card sat on her kitchen counter with the particular presence of something that is deliberately not being looked at. And she went to work and came home and slept and woke and told herself, with decreasing conviction each morning, that the dinner had been what it was, a courtesy, an acknowledgement, a transaction completed, and that Dante Voss had returned to his world and she had remained in hers, and that was the correct and sensible outcome. On the 4th day, he walked into the Veller at 7 in the evening and sat at the corner table. Her table. She saw him the moment he came through the door. She would have known him in a crowded stadium, which was an observation she made and immediately filed under things not to examine, and she stood at the service station for exactly 3 seconds before she picked up her notepad and crossed the room. She set a menu in front of him. He didn't look at it. You know the menu, she said. I do. Then why are you looking at me instead of it? Because, he said, the menu is not interesting. She looked at him steadily. He looked back with that absolute composure, that controlled stillness, and beneath it, barely, like a light behind frosted glass, something that she was beginning to recognize as the specific warmth he did not know what to do with. The duck, she said, and I'll tell the sommelier to pull the burgundy you had last time. She walked away before he could respond. She felt his eyes on her back until she rounded the corner. In the kitchen, her colleague Petra Schar, pied, perpetually amused, the kind of woman who had narrated her own life since childhood, looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. Then, that's Dante Voss, yes, sitting in your section. Yes, Mara, Petra, that is Dante Voss. I heard you the first time. Petra leaned against the counter with the expression of someone watching a very compelling disaster assemble itself. He was just here 4 days ago. He comes once a month, always. She paused. He came back. He's a customer. Mara said. He is a Mara. He is not just a Petra. Mara picked up a tray. Her voice was measured, not cold, but finished. He's a customer. I'm going to do my job. She went back out. She served him with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every table. No performance, no special attention, no acknowledgement of anything beyond the professional transaction of a meal being delivered and received. She refilled his water. She brought the wine. She answered his single question about the fish preparation with the clean accuracy of someone who knew the menu with genuine knowledge rather than memorized script. And she watched from the corner of her attention the way he watched her. He watched her the way a person watches something they are trying to understand. Not possessively, not obviously, but with a continuity that was different from the way men usually watched her, which was the watching of appraisal or desire or boredom looking for distraction. This was something more like study, like he was reading a text in a language he was still learning, and he was not going to look away until he'd gotten the meaning. It made her hands very steady. She had learned long ago that the correct response to being observed was not to contract but to become more precisely herself. When she brought his bill, he didn't reach for it immediately. "Sit with me," he said. "I'm working. Your shift ends in 12 minutes. She looked at him. "You timed your arrival to my shift schedule," she said. "I'm a thorough person," he said. The audacity of it was so complete that it came back around to being almost disarming. She looked at him for a moment, at the steady dark eyes, at the jaw set with its permanent quality of quiet command, at the hands resting on the table with that characteristic stillness, and she thought about Illy, who had always said that the most dangerous thing in the world was a man who was honest about what he wanted. She sat down. She sat down in the chair across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him and said nothing. Waiting, the move was his. He looked at her hands for a moment. Then up. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me, the man who sent the shooters on Thursday night." A pause, the kind of pause that carried information in itself. "He knows about you now." The air in the room changed, not dramatically, not in any way that the other diners, in their expensive clothes and their private conversations, would have noticed. But to Mara, who had spent her entire life calibrating the atmosphere of rooms for shifts and safety, it was as clear as a pressure change before a storm. "How," she said, "there were witnesses, staff, the story of what you did, what you heard. What you did about it reached people it shouldn't have reached." His voice was entirely controlled, but there was something moving beneath it. Something that she was learning to identify as the way his control tightened when something mattered to him. "His name is Callum Straight. He runs the Eastern Distribution Network, or he did, until we had a disagreement about the terms of that arrangement." "A disagreement," she said. "The professional kind, and now he knows who I am, yes." She absorbed this. She looked down at the table. At her own hands, folded with that stillness that people sometimes mistook for serenity, and that was actually something more structural, the architecture of a person who has learned that panic is a luxury. "What does he plan to do about it?" she said. "Nothing," Dante said, "because I'm not going to allow him to." She looked up. He held her gaze. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know the situation," he said. "Not because I'm asking your permission for how I handle it. This is mine to handle, but you should not be walking home alone at night. You should not be taking routes you can be followed on. And you should not be dismissing the security arrangements I'm prepared to offer you as an imposition on your independence." The last sentence had a quality to it and not quite sharp, but precise in a way that told her he had listened to her, had anticipated her exact objection, and had addressed it preemptively. She hated that she was slightly impressed. "I don't want a bodyguard," she said. "I know. I don't want to change how I live because of something that has nothing to do with me. I know that too." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city hummed, the other diners murmured, a glass clinked somewhere. "I'm asking," he said, "for you to take this seriously. Not for my sake." A pause. "For yours." She looked at him. He was not performing concern. She had known enough performers in her life, had grown up surrounded by people who used emotion as currency, traded in it, weaponized it, and she knew the difference. This was not performed. This was something sitting in his chest that had found its way to the surface because he had not been fast enough to keep it down, and he was not pretending it wasn't there, but he was not sure what to do with it either. Something moved in her own chest. She acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged graze on her arm. A yes. This is real, yes, it exists. File it, continue. I'll take it seriously. She said, "Good. But I won't stop walking." He looked at her. "Mara, I'll carry my phone. I'll stay on lit streets. I'll call the number on that card if I feel watched." She held his gaze. "But I will not restructure my life for a man I met 4 days ago, even if he's trying to protect me." The weight of her own words landed between them with a clarity that seemed to surprise both of them. Even if he's trying to protect me. She had said it plainly, without softening it, and it sat there naming the thing they had both been carefully not naming. Dante said nothing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then, in a voice that was very controlled, "I'm not asking you to restructure your life." "What are you asking?" Silence. Outside, a bus passed on the street below. Its lights moved across the ceiling of the restaurant like the sweep of a slow tide. "I don't know yet," he said. She had not expected that. He had not expected to say it. It sat between them raw and honest and slightly astonishing, coming from a man who always knew exactly what he wanted and never admitted otherwise. She looked at him for a long time. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said quietly. "Don't get used to it," he said. "I won't," she said. But the small warmth in her voice when she said it made it clear that was not entirely true. She began to see him more often, not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves. He came to the Veller on Tuesdays now as well as Thursdays, once on a Wednesday afternoon when she was coming off a shift. She found him on the sidewalk outside, not waiting exactly, but present in the way that said he had known she would be there, and had arranged his own presence accordingly. They had walked together for 2 blocks before she turned for home, and he'd continued without comment, as if it were perfectly ordinary for the most powerful criminal in city to stroll down Alderton Street beside a waitress in a service uniform. Petra watched all of this with the contained energy of someone sitting on extremely important information who has been expressly forbidden from sharing it. The staff at the Veller watched with varying degrees of discretion, meaning they watched quite openly but tried to make it look accidental. The manager, whose name was Howard and who had always possessed the particular blend of obliviousness and self-preservation that made him effective in his role, simply ensured that Mara was always assigned the corner section on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and said nothing further. What no one saw, what happened in the smaller, quieter spaces between the visible moments, was something that resisted easy description. They talked. That was the most accurate way to put it. They talked in the way that 2 people talk when they are both accustomed to not talking carefully, precisely, with the specific pleasure of someone discovering that the person across from them understands the vocabulary they'd assumed was private. He told her things about the city, the real architecture of it, the layers beneath the official version, the way power moved through it like water through stone. Not as confession, not as boast, but as the kind of sharing that happens when someone is for the first time in a very long time not performing for their audience. She told him about Ellie in pieces, small ones at first, offered carefully, watched to see how he held them. He held them well without pity, which she could not have endured, and without the careful neutrality of someone managing her grief at arm's length, with something that felt like genuine receiving, like the information mattered to him. She told him about the night Illy died, just once, just the outline of it, the call that came in wrong, the address that was delayed, the minutes that should have been different. She told him with her eyes on middle distance and her voice level and her hands flat on her knees. And when she finished, the silence was the kind that had weight and substance, and she didn't try to fill it. He reached across the table, stopped. His hand rested on the table between them, not touching hers, but close enough that the choice had been made. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. She covered his hand with hers for a moment, brief, contained, nothing more than a few seconds, and then withdrew. Neither of them spoke. It was the most intimate thing that had happened between them. Neither of them would have been able to explain why. The morning she found out about Callum Straight's next move, she was at work, and it didn't come from Dante. It came from a man who sat in her section and ordered coffee, and left a folded piece of paper under his cup, plain white, no envelope, the kind of message that wanted to look like a mistake, like a forgotten receipt, like nothing. She unfolded it in the kitchen. It said, "He knows you're important to him. That makes you useful. Consider your options." She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to her tables. She served the rest of her shift without her face changing by a single degree. But something behind her eyes went very quiet and very cold and very focused, the way things had gone when she was 20, 2-year-old EMT arriving at a scene and understanding in the first second that the situation was worse than the call had described. That particular focusing of everything that wasn't essential, that particular gathering of self. She took her break at 4. She went to the back corridor. She took out her phone. He answered on the first ring. Mara. Someone sat in my section. Today, she said. He left me a note. It said, you know, I'm important to you. That makes me useful. A silence not long, maybe 4 seconds, but in those 4 seconds she heard, in the texture of the silence itself, something she had never heard from him before. She heard fear, not for himself. Don't move, he said. His voice was still controlled, but only just. I mean that literally. Stay in the building, don't go outside. I'm sending Dante. He stopped. I'm not in danger right now, she said. I'm in the back corridor of a restaurant. It's fine. I'm telling you because you need to know, not because I need to be rescued. Another silence. I need you to be somewhere I can. He stopped again. She heard the particular quality of a man choosing his words with extreme care because the unguarded ones would say too much. Somewhere you can what? She said softly. Nothing. The corridor was quiet around her. The sounds of the kitchen. Distant murmur of the dining room. The ordinary music of a functioning world. Somewhere I can be certain you're safe. He said finally. The sentence was careful, measured, and it was also completely transparent in a way that she suspected he knew and had allowed. She leaned her shoulder against the wall. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Come here when you can, she said. Still, be on shift for 2 hours. Come and sit in my section and drink your wine and stop sounding like that. Like what? He said. She hesitated. Like someone who's just realized something frightening, she said. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped a register, quieter, less controlled, more real than she had ever heard it. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours. She confirmed. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and her hand pressed flat against her sternum, and that thing in her chest that she had been relocating for 2 weeks sat absolutely still and refused to be moved. She stopped trying. She went back to work, and 45 minutes later, not 2 hours, 45 minutes, Dante Voss walked through the door of the Veller and sat at the corner table and looked across the room at her with an expression that he did not manage to neutralize before she saw it. Raw. Unguarded. The expression of a man who has been running from something for a very long time and has just discovered he has run himself directly into it. She brought him his wine. She didn't see anything, neither did he, but as she set the glass down, his hand came up, barely the smallest movement, a fraction of intention, and his fingers brushed the back of her wrist. She didn't pull away. The touch lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was nothing. It was the most nothing gesture in the world. It rearranged everything. She walked back to her station with her heart perfectly steady and her face perfectly composed, and something behind her eyes that was either the beginning of something extraordinary or the beginning of something that was going to cost her more than she had. She thought briefly of Ellie. Some things are worth the cost, he had told her once, on a cold night when they were teenagers and the world seemed arranged specifically against them. The trick is knowing which ones. She picked up her tray. She went back to work. The thing about secrets is that they don't break all at once. They crack. Slowly, invisibly, the way ice cracks on a river in early spring. You don't see the fracture until the whole surface has shifted, until the ground you thought was solid has become something that moves beneath your feet. And by then, the cracking has been happening for a long time. By then, you have simply been walking on something that was never as stable as it looked. Dante Voss had kept his secrets for 18 years. He was very good at it. He had learned from his father, who had been better at it still, who had worn his private life like a second skin, smooth and unmarked, who had taken most of what he knew to a grave that Dante himself had arranged at the age of 20, for with the particular grief of a son who loved his father and was also the reason his father was dead. That was the secret beneath all the other secrets. That was the thing folded at the center of him that no one had ever touched, that he had never spoken aloud, that he carried the way you carry a stone in your chest always, until you forget it. There, until something presses on it, and the pain is as fresh as the first day. His father's name was Edouard. He had been a careful man, a quiet man, a man who had built the Voss operation from a small territorial arrangement in the west side of the city into something that reached into every significant transaction that moved through this place. He had been brilliant, and he had been ruthless, and he had also on Sunday mornings made his son breakfast and told him stories about a village in the south of France that Edouard had left at 17 and never returned to, and those Sunday mornings had been the only hours of the week when Dante had understood that the world contained softness as well as stone. Edouard had been killed because of a miscalculation. A trust extended too far, to a man who had smiled too easily and said all the right things, and Dante at 24 had understood the mistake before the body was cold and had dealt with it with a swiftness and a completeness that had established in one night exactly what kind of man his father's son was going to be. He had not told anyone what the miscalculation had cost him. Not Wren, who was the closest thing to a friend he had, and who understood most things without being told. Not the men who served him with genuine loyalty, and some of them with something approaching affection. No one. He had folded that morning, that last Sunday morning, his father's coffee going cold on the counter, the story about the village in France half finished, and he had put it somewhere inside himself. That was not accessible, and he had become the man he needed to become. And he had done it so thoroughly and for so long that there were days, most days, when he believed the man he had become was the only one that had ever existed. And then Mara Sorrel had put her body between him and a bullet and looked at him afterward without fear. And somewhere in the architecture of everything he had built, something had shifted. He didn't name it, he was not ready to name it, but he felt it, the way you feel a draft in a house when a window you forgot existed is opened somewhere. Wren came to him on a Thursday morning with the look he wore when the information he was carrying was the kind that required a specific kind of delivery. Dante was at his desk, the office in the East Building, the one that looked out over the river, the one with the clean lines and the sparse furnishings that reflected the same aesthetic principle as everything else in his life. Nothing that isn't necessary, nothing that doesn't serve a function. He was reading contracts. He did not look up when Wren entered. Straight is moving faster than we projected, Wren said. Dante turned a page. How much faster? The note to the girl was a test, to see how she'd respond, whether she'd run, whether she'd go to the police, whether she'd come to us. A pause. She came to us. I know. Straight knows too. He has someone inside the Veller. Dante stopped turning pages. Name, he said, Howard Pell, the manager, of course. Howard, with his obliviousness and his self-preservation, had apparently found the calculus of self-preservation pointing in a different direction than Dante would have preferred. Deal with it, he said, already in process. Wren came further into the room. He stood on the other side of the desk with his hands at his sides and his face wearing that particular expression, the measured look of a man about to say something his companion will not enjoy hearing. There's something else. Dante looked up. Straight isn't just watching her, Wren said. He's been watching her for 3 days. He knows her schedule. He knows her route home. He knows. A careful pause. He knows the layout of her apartment building. The room was very quiet. The river moved outside the window. A bird crossed the glass. Somewhere in the building, something mechanical clicked and hummed and fell silent. When Dante said, his voice was different, not louder, the opposite. Quieter in the specific way of a very dangerous thing going very still. We don't know. Soon, he wants leverage, not a body, at least initially. He wants to use her to get to you. Wren's eyes were steady on him, which means he's confirmed something about the situation that I think you may not have fully confirmed to yourself yet. Dante looked at him. Wren held the look. In 3 years of friendship and 11 years of professional partnership, they had never had many conversations that required explicit statement. They had developed, between them, a private language of inference and implication, efficient, emotionally low-cost, brutally accurate. Wren said a thing by not saying it. Dante heard it by not acknowledging it. But this was the first time that Wren had looked at him and held the look, and the meaning was inescapable. Straight had confirmed something about Dante's feelings for Mara, about what she had become to him, and Wren was looking at him as if waiting for the same confirmation. Dante looked down at the contracts. Double the watch on her building. He said, I want someone on her at all times, someone good, someone who won't be seen, And Ren, yes? She can't know about this. She'll figure it out. Ren said, I know. Dante said, but not yet. Ren was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said carefully, that not telling her is its own kind of risk. Yes. She's not a woman who will respond well to being. I know what kind of woman she is. Dante said. The words came out with a heat that neither of them had expected. A clean, uncontrolled heat. The heat of something said from the center rather than from the perimeter. Ren was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. I think you do. He left. Dante sat at his desk for a long time after the door closed. He was not reading the contracts. He was looking at the river and feeling the particular quality of something that has been contained for too long in too small a space beginning to press against its own edges. He thought about Mara walking home, her steady footsteps, her hand flat against her sternum in that gesture he had noticed, the one she made when she was feeling something she was trying to manage. He thought about the 2 seconds his fingers had rested against the back of her wrist and what he had felt in those 2 seconds, which was the terrifying and inconvenient and completely accurate sense of arriving somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward. He thought about his father's voice, about a village in the south of France, about the specific cost of letting someone matter. He sat very still. Then he picked up his phone. He did not call Mara. He called the man who ran his security operations and gave a series of instructions that were very specific and very thorough. And when he was done, he set the phone down and opened the contract again and read them without comprehension for an hour. She knew she was being followed on Friday. She knew in the way she knew most things, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small signals that her body processed before her mind did. A figure at the same distance for 2 blocks. A car that idled too long outside the Veller. A familiar face, briefly, in an unfamiliar context. The specific feeling on the back of her neck that she had learned to trust. She turned a corner, stopped, let her follower pass. He was young, mid-20s, professionally dressed but not expensively, with the look of someone doing a job they'd been given very specific instructions about. He had not expected her to stop. He walked past her with his eyes forward, and the almost imperceptible rigidity of someone pretending very hard to be ordinary. She watched him continue down the block. She took out her phone, dialed. You're having me followed, she said when he answered. A silence, Mara, don't. Her voice was not raised. It was very level. The specific level of a voice that is choosing not to become other things. Don't apologize or explain yet. Just answer the question. Are you having me followed? Yes, he said. Since when? 3 days. Because of straight, yes. She looked down the block. The young man had disappeared around a corner. She stood on the sidewalk in the early evening, the city moving around her, and she breathed for a moment. You should have told me, she said. I know. I'm not someone you arrange things for without my knowledge. I'm not. She stopped. Gathered herself. I am not one of your assets, Dante. I'm a person. You don't get to make decisions about my safety without consulting me. If I had consulted you, he said, you would have said no. Yes, she said. I would have, and that is my right. Not when Callum Strait has the layout of your apartment building. The silence that followed was the silence of something landing very hard. She stood completely still. The city moved. The light was going golden at the edges of the buildings, that particular late afternoon gold that made even difficult cities look briefly like paintings. He has the layout of my building, she said. Yes, how long have you known? Since Thursday morning. Thursday, she stopped. Something moved across her face that was not fear, and not quite anger, something more complicated. Something that had her and Illy, and the cost of caring about things all tangled up together in it. You've known for 2 days and you didn't tell me. I was handling it. By having someone follow me without my knowledge while you handled it. Yes, Dante, I know, he said. And in those 2 words, in the exact weight of them, she heard what he had been hearing about himself, the acknowledgement, the understanding of what he had done and why he had done it and what that meant about what she was to him. It did not fix anything, but it landed differently than she'd expected. "Where is he now?" she said. "The man following me. Probably at the corner of Alderton and 5th, trying to look like he's waiting for a bus. He's not very good at it. He's excellent at it. You're just very observant." She almost laughed. She controlled it. This was not a moment for almost laughing. "I'm going home," she said. "Mara." "I'm going home. Your man can follow me if he must, but tomorrow you're going to sit across from me and tell me everything you've been handling without my knowledge. Everything. Not the version you think I can manage, the actual version." A pause. "Okay," he said, and Dante, "Yes, I'm not angry that you were trying to protect me." Her voice was careful. "Honest, I'm angry that you thought protecting me meant keeping me blind. A breath. There's a difference." She hung up. She walked home. She was aware of the young man trailing her at a careful distance, and she made no further effort to lose him. She walked at her own pace, through her own streets, with her own thoughts, which were occupied, in equal and competing measure, with the threat of Callum Strait and the particular look on Dante's face the last time she had seen him, the look he'd been wearing when he walked into the Veller 45 minutes early because she'd said stop sounding like that and he had come anyway, had come immediately, and she had understood in that moment that she was not the only one fighting something. She pressed her hand to her sternum, walked. Ellie's voice, somewhere at the back of her mind. "Some things are worth the cost. Tell me which ones," she thought back. But Ellie had been dead for 3 years, and he didn't answer. She could not sleep. She lay in her apartment in the small hours of the morning, with the city breathing its dark breath outside her window. And she thought about the 2 seconds in the restaurant when his fingers had touched her wrist. She thought about the Sunday morning quality of it, that specific tenderness, that thing that comes from nowhere in a person and surprises them and means more than they meant to let it mean. She thought about his voice when he'd said, "Somewhere I can be certain you're safe." The way the sentence had cracked almost imperceptibly in the middle. The way the word certain had carried a weight it wasn't supposed to carry. She thought about her brother. She thought about the last time she had let herself love something and what it had cost. She sat up, the dark apartment, the hum of the city, the small red eye of the smoke detector blinking its steady rhythm on the ceiling. She looked at it for a long time, that patient, mechanical red blink, and she thought about what it meant to be afraid of something and want it anyway, what it meant to know the exact shape of a risk and choose to hold it in your hands regardless. She reached for her phone. She looked at his number. She put the phone down. She lay back. She was still awake when the sky outside her window began to change. That subtle, preliminary lightening that preceded dawn. The city shifting from black to deep gray to something that was almost possible. And in that transitional light, she made a decision that she did not think about carefully and did not examine and did not allow herself to qualify. She was going to stop fighting it, not the danger. The danger she was going to fight with everything she had clear-eyed, practical, fully informed, as she should have been from the beginning. But the other thing, the thing in her chest that refused to be relocated. The thing that had started when she'd covered his hand with hers and neither of them had spoken, and that had been quietly restructuring everything inside her ever since. She was going to stop fighting it. She closed her eyes. She did not think about the cost. She slept. In the East Building, in the office that looked over the river, Dante Voss was also not sleeping. He sat at his desk, not working, which was unusual for him because work was the architecture that held everything else in its correct position, and he looked at his phone. At the last call in his log, her name, which he had entered with no title and no context, just Mara, which was itself a thing he had not fully processed. Just Mara, he had been running empires since he was 24 years old. He had made decisions that moved markets and altered territories and ended careers, and occasionally ended more than careers. He had sat across tables from men who wanted to destroy him and had been the calmest person in the room. He had never, not once in 18 years, felt uncertain about what he was doing. He felt uncertain now. Not about protecting her. That was the one thing he was not uncertain about. Not the how or the why or the cost. He would spend whatever needed spending and do whatever needed doing and face whatever needed facing. And that clarity was so clean and so complete that it told him everything he had been refusing to examine. He was uncertain about the other side of it, about what it meant that he cared, about what would happen when she found out, fully, completely, exactly what the world he operated in looked like from the inside. Not the curated version she'd encountered so far, not the controlled narrative of a powerful man with a violent history, but a certain complexity of character. The full thing, the unedited thing. He thought about his father's voice, about the story that had been half finished on that last Sunday morning, about the village in France and the girl his father had loved there at 17, and the specific quality of grief his father had carried quietly for the rest of his life without ever fully naming it. He had always thought he understood that grief, the grief of something loved and lost. He was beginning to understand there was another kind, the grief of something close and not yet lost, the specific fear of the moment before. He looked at his phone. He put it in his desk drawer. He went to the window and looked at the river, beginning to catch the first gray light of the approaching morning. And he stood there for a very long time in the silence of a man who has just understood something that is going to change everything, and could not decide yet whether that was a beginning or an ending. The meeting was set for Saturday evening, not at the Veller, not at the warehouse by the river. She had named the place herself, a small cafe on Brennan Street, the kind that had been there for 30 years and smelled of old wood and coffee, and the specific comfort of things that do not change. She had chosen it deliberately, on his territory, in his spaces, surrounded by his architecture. She was always navigating something. Here, on ground she knew, she was simply herself. He arrived exactly on time. She was already there, at a corner table. She had chosen a corner table without thinking about it, and only realized afterward that she had absorbed that particular habit from him, the instinct to have a wall at your back, and the recognition of this had made her laugh once quietly to herself, and then feel something tender and slightly alarming. He came through the door, and she watched him cross the room toward her, and she thought, not for the first time, about how completely wrong it was that a man like this should be able to move the way he moved, that contained unhurried authority, that quality of someone for whom every room is approximately the same temperature, regardless of what the room contains. He sat down, he looked at her, she looked at him. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her. Not all at once, it came in pieces, methodical, precise, the way he did everything. He told her about Callum Strait, the full version, not the curated one, the history of their arrangement, the nature of their disagreement, the specific shape of Strait's ambition, and the specific shape of his grudge. He told her about the shooting, about who had pulled the trigger, and who had given the order, and the chain of command that connected the two. He told her about the informant at the Veller, about Howard Pell and his reassignment, which she understood to mean something considerably more permanent than a change of workplace. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "How dangerous is he?" she said. "Very, to me specifically. He wants you as leverage, not as a target. There's a difference, but it isn't a comfortable one." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked up. "What are you doing about it?" "Everything necessary." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you in this cafe on Brennan Street," he said. Some of the details would require a different kind of venue. She understood what that meant. She looked at him steadily. "Will it be over?" she said. "Soon." "Yes." "How sure are you?" "Completely." She studied him, the clean certainty of it. The way he said completely. The way other people said, "I think so," or "I hope so." With no room in the word for any other possibility. She had learned over these weeks that this was not arrogance. It was something more structural. The certainty of a man who had never once allowed himself the luxury of doubt in operational matters, because doubt was the crack through which the catastrophic entered. She believed him. "Okay," she said. "That's all. What else would you like me to say?" He looked at her. Most people would ask more questions, push harder, want more reassurance. I'm not most people, she said. And you've already told me the most important part, which is that you're telling me, she said. The full version, not the version you thought I could manage. Her eyes held his. That's the most important part. Something moved through his expression. Slow, seismic, barely visible, but she was watching closely enough to see it. The specific movement of a man encountering grace he wasn't prepared for. He looked down at the table. I should have told you sooner, he said. Yes, I was. He stopped. She waited. I was trying to keep it away from you, he said, the full weight of it. He pressed his jaw together briefly. I am accustomed to managing things so that the people another stop. The sentence had a destination he hadn't reached yet, and he was watching it approach with the expression of someone who knows the terrain ahead is unfamiliar. She said nothing. She simply waited in the particular way she had, the stillness that wasn't passive, that was full of attention and space and the complete absence of pressure. She had learned that this was sometimes the most powerful thing she could offer, just the room, just the space. Just I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and you can take as long as you need. The people I care about, he said finally. The words landed in the quiet cafe with the weight of something that had been a long time coming. He had said them quietly, without performance, without the careful management of tone that she had come to associate with his public face. He had said them the way you say something when you have stopped being able to not say it. She looked at him. His eyes came up to meet hers. The cafe moved around them, the soft sounds of other conversations, the hiss of the coffee machine, someone laughing at the counter, the ordinary beautiful noise of the world continuing. And in the middle of it, this table, this corner, these two people sitting 3 feet apart with 18 years of his armor and 3 years of her grief between them, and something else now too. Something that was not armor and not grief. Something that was the most frightening thing either of them had felt in a very long time. Dante, she said softly. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm not. She breathed. I'm not going to pretend I haven't felt it too. The silence that followed was the longest one they had ever shared. It was not empty. It was full to the edges. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something and looking down and knowing that the drop is real, and the ground at the bottom is real, and that none of that, not one single piece of it, changes what they are about to do. He reached across the table, slowly. With intention, not impulse. This was not the brush of fingers that had happened at the Veller, that accidental, on purpose half gesture. This was deliberate. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, and he held it. Simply, without pressure, without urgency, without any of the complexity that surrounded every other aspect of both their lives. His hand was warm. She had not expected it to be warm. She turned her hand over beneath his, held back. Neither of them spoke. Outside the cafe windows, the Saturday evening city moved through its own life, indifferent and brilliant and beautiful, doing what cities do. She had 40 minutes of peace. Then his phone rang. She felt it in the change of his hand, the almost imperceptible tightening, the shift of attention that happened before he'd even processed the sound. She watched his face change. The softness, and it had been soft, or something adjacent to soft, in the particular way of someone who doesn't do softness, but is doing it now. The softness closed. Not coldly, but with the efficiency of something practiced over many years. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. I have to take this. Go, she said. He stepped away from the table. She watched him stand near the window with the phone to his ear and his back partially turned, and she watched the transformation, the slight straightening, the stillness that became less personal and more operational, the language of his shoulders shifting from something private to something professional. She watched it with clear eyes, without illusion. This was who he was. Not only this, she knew now that not only this was real, the Sunday. Morning quality was real, the warmth was real, but this too. This completely and without remainder. She had known that from the beginning. She had sat across from it at her restaurant 40. 3 floors above the city, and recognized it and chosen to stay at the table anyway. She was not going to pretend that had been an accident. He came back. He did not sit down. "I have to go," he said. She looked at his face. What happened? Straight moved up the timeline. She stood. "Mara, don't tell me to stay here," she said. "I'm not going to tell you to stay here. I'm going to tell you to go directly to the East Building. Not your apartment, not the Veller, the East Building, and stay there until I contact you." "Your building?" "Yes." She looked at him. "You're asking me to trust you," she said. "Yes. Completely. Yes." She picked up her coat. She looked at him one more time, at the face she had memorized without meaning to. At the man who was the most complicated thing she had encountered in her carefully constructed life. At the hairline cracks in the armor that only she had ever seen. And she made the decision she had already made in the gray light before dawn, the one she had stopped fighting. "Be careful," she said. Something happened in his face, quick, controlled, but she saw it. She had learned to see what happened in the space of a moment in that face. The things that arrived and were immediately managed. This one was not managed fast enough. It looked like being seen. It looked like someone who had not been careful with being seen for a very long time, and was not certain how to hold it, and was holding it anyway. "Go," he said. His voice was rough at the edge of it, the single syllable of a man who is holding many things at once. "I'll call you." She went. The East Building at 9 on a Saturday night was quiet in the specific way of a place that is always occupied but rarely loud. Wren met her at the entrance. She had expected this, had calibrated herself for it, and he took her to a room on the upper floor that was not an office and not a cell, and not anything she'd expected, which was a sitting room with actual comfortable furniture, and a shelf of actual books, and a window overlooking the river. Wren stood in the doorway for a moment. "He'll be a few hours," he said. "I know." He started to leave. "Wren," she said. He turned. She looked at him, this careful, watchful man who had been beside Dante for more than 2 decades, who knew him in ways she hadn't yet earned and might never fully earn. She looked at him with the question she hadn't asked Dante directly, because some questions were not Dante's to answer. "Is he going to be okay?" she said. Wren studied her. "He's the most capable man I've ever known," he said. "That's not what I asked." A pause. Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening, a recalibration, the expression of someone who had expected less honesty and is adjusting accordingly. "He'll be okay," he said. "He's done this before." "Has he had something to come back for before?" she said. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. "No," Wren said quietly. "He hasn't. He left." She sat in the room with the books and the view of the river, and she held herself very still, and she did not allow herself to imagine anything beyond the next moment, and the moment after that, and the moment after that. This was the discipline she had built in the aftermath of Uli, the practice of present, tense living, of refusing to let the mind construct catastrophes out of the available materials. One moment at a time, that was the contract she had made with herself, and she honored it now. She picked a book from the shelf. She opened it. She read the same paragraph 4 times. She put the book down. She went to the window and looked at the river. He came back at 1:17 in the morning. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps in the corridor, the particular cadence of his walk, which she had memorized without intending to, and then the door. He came in without knocking. He had forgotten to knock. She understood immediately, which meant something, that in this moment, coming back to this room and this person, the usual protocols had not arrived in time. She turned from the window. He stopped in the doorway. He was not injured. She checked this in the first second with the eyes of an EMT, no blood, no favoring of any limb, no pallor. He was intact. He was also wearing the specific expression of a man who has just come from something that required all of him, and is now standing on the other side of it, and finding the room on the other side contained something he wasn't sure would still be there. She was still there. "It's done," he said, straight. "Yes, done meaning you can walk home alone," he said. "Done meaning Howard Pell will not be a problem. Done meaning the situation has been resolved." A pause. Completely. She looked at him. Are you hurt? She said. No. Are you sure, Mara? His voice. Her name. The specific way he said it that she had learned was the sound of someone trying to contain something that was bigger than the container. She crossed the room. She didn't think about it. She had stopped performing the thinking about it, the deliberation, the careful management of distance. She crossed the room and she stood in front of him, and she looked at his face, the controlled face, the jaw, the dark eyes that gave nothing away and were giving everything away right now. And she put her hand against his chest. His hand came up and covered hers. She felt his heartbeat, fast, faster than the composed exterior suggested. The body keeping its own honest record. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and for a long moment neither of them moved or breathed or did anything except exist in that space together. Two people who had spent their entire lives building very particular kinds of fortitude, standing inside the walls of it and feeling those walls for the first time as something that could be opened rather than merely defended. I was afraid, he said. She looked at him. Not out there, he said. His voice was low, each word placed carefully, like someone carrying something fragile across uncertain ground. Out there I was fine. I've always been fine out there. He paused. I was afraid in here. He meant it literally, this room, this place, but also not literally. She understood both. I know, she said softly. I kept thinking. He stopped. Tell me. I kept thinking that I would come back and you would have decided it wasn't worth it. His jaw tightened. That the thing I am, the full thing, not the version you can meet in a restaurant or a cafe, that it would have become too clear and you would have. He stopped again. The sentence had an ending he was not allowing it to reach. She looked at him for a long moment. Dante, she said. He looked at her. I grew up in Callaway District, she said quietly. I watched my brother navigate the exact geography of what you are for 27 years. I became an EMT in the city you run. I walked home alone at night through streets that belonged to you, and men like you and I knew exactly what that meant. She paused. I have never once not known what you are. He was very still. I'm here anyway, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that happens after something irrevocable is said. Not a bad irrevocable, the other kind. The kind where something that was held privately is placed in the space between two people and becomes, by that act, something shared. Something that exists now outside either of them and belongs to both. His hand, still covering hers against his chest, tightened. Not painfully, not desperately, with the particular grip of someone who is holding something for the first time and trying to understand the weight of it. She looked up at him, he looked down at her. And then he did the thing she hadn't expected, which was not to kiss her, not to reach for her, not to cross the remaining distance in any of the ways she had imagined. He lowered his head and rested it very gently against hers, forehead to forehead, eyes closed, breathing the same air. Just that. Just the contact of two foreheads in a quiet room above a river at 1:17 in the morning, the city burning patiently outside, the weight of both their histories in the room with them, and for this one moment all of it set down, and just this. She closed her eyes, her hand pressed flat against his chest. His heart beat under her palm. She felt his breath go ragged at the edges. Once, just once, the only sound of fracture in the entire composed architecture of him, small and real and terrible in its honesty, the sound of someone who has been holding something for so long that the setting down of it is almost more than can be borne. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply stayed, fully, completely, without reservation. She stayed. And in the warmth and the dark and the quiet of that room, with the river moving outside and the city moving around it, something that had been clenched for 18 years in the chest of Dante Vati opened not dramatically, not all at once, like a fist slowly becoming a hand, the way things open when they finally feel safe. The morning came in slowly, gray light at the edges of the curtains, the river catching it in long, pale ribbons. The city beginning its daily reclamation of itself, the first buses, the first voices, the first sounds of a world that had continued without interruption through the night while two people sat in a room above it and set things down. Mara woke in the chair by the window. She didn't remember falling asleep. She remembered the forehead, the heartbeat under her palm, the specific quality of that silence. And then, somewhere in the small hours, the exhaustion of weeks of careful vigilance had simply collected its debt, and she had slept. Deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of someone whose body had finally believed, even temporarily, that it was safe. She sat up slowly. Dante was across the room in the chair beside the door. He had not slept. She could see it in the specific quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of someone who had been awake for a long time, watching. He was looking at her. He had, she understood, been looking at her for some time. She met his gaze. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The morning moved around them like water. "You stayed," she said. "Yes, you watched me sleep." "I did." "That should be unsettling." "And is it?" She considered. "No," she said. Something moved in his expression, that specific warmth. The one that arrived without permission, and that she had watched him manage and failed to manage and manage again over these weeks. This time he didn't reach for it to contain it. He let it be there. It changed his face entirely. Not dramatically. He was never going to be a man of dramatic expressions. The architecture of him was too long established for that. But in the slight release of his jaw, in the quality of his eyes, in the way his shoulders sat in the chair, not armored, for once, simply there, she saw the man that existed beneath the director. Beneath the empire, beneath the 18 years of careful construction. He was quieter than she'd expected, and younger, looking, and something she didn't have a word for, something in the neighborhood of waiting to be known. She stood, smoothed her dress, looked out at the river. "What happens now?" she said. "In what sense?" "In every sense." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him stand, heard his footsteps deliberate, crossing the room, and then he was beside her at the window, looking out at the same river, the same gray morning, the same city doing what it always did. "I don't know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're saying that again," she said. "I find it's becoming a habit," he said. "Around you, not knowing things, saying so out loud." She looked back at the river. The gray was warming at the edges now, the first true light beginning to find the water. "Straight is done," she said. "Yes. The threat is resolved. Yes. Which means," she said carefully, "that the circumstances that brought us into each other's orbit are over." He said nothing. "You don't need to protect me anymore," she said. "And I don't need to be in this building or any of your buildings. I can go back to my apartment and my shifts and my 40-minute walks home and my life." She paused. "And you can go back to yours." The silence stretched. Outside the window, a bird crossed the river, low, swift, certain of its direction. "Is that what you want?" he said. She looked at him, his profile in the morning light. The jaw, the controlled set of his expression, the eyes that were watching the river with the particular attention of someone who is not watching the river at all. The hairline cracks she had spent weeks learning, the Sunday, morning quality she had not expected and could not now unknow. "No," she said simply. He turned to look at her. "But I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not going to exist in your world as a secret or a protected variable or an arrangement. I won't be managed or handled or kept comfortable in a room with books and a river view while decisions are made around me." She held his gaze. "If I am in your life, I am in your life, present, informed, treated as someone whose judgment matters, a breath." "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long time. She watched him process. It watched the specific quality of a man who had been the sole architect of his own world for 18 years, encountering the genuine terms of someone else. Not with resistance, with something more interesting than resistance, something that looked like recognition. Like a man who has been handed a mirror and is looking at what it shows and finding it, against all expectation, not terrible. "I've never done that," he said. "I know, with anyone. I know that too. I will make mistakes," he said. "The habits are," he stopped. "I will manage things that should not be managed. I will make decisions that should be made together, and I won't realize until after. I have been doing this alone for so long that the instinct runs deep." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "And when that happens, I'll tell you, clearly and directly and without making you guess what I mean." She paused. "But Dante, yes, You have to let me. He understood the full meaning of it, not just the surface. He had to let her tell him. He had to let the correction land and not close around it. He had to remain. This was the actual thing she was asking. The hardest thing, permeable. Accessible to her, in a way he had not been accessible to anyone. He looked at the river for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Okay, he said one word. But in it she heard the fullness of it, the understanding of what he was agreeing to, the specific cost of it for a man built the way he was built. She heard the choice in it, the conscious, clear-eyed, unqualified choice. She nodded once. And then he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, simply, quietly, his thumb resting for a moment against her cheekbone. And she leaned into it very slightly, instinctively. Way you lean into warmth without deciding to. And he looked at her with that expression she had no word for, and she looked back with the full weight of everything she was. He kissed her gently, without urgency. The way you do something for the first time when you intend to do it many more times, and you want to do it right. His hand moved from her cheekbone to her jaw, and she reached up and held his wrist, not to stop him, just to hold, just to feel the pulse of him under her fingers, and the morning light came through the window and fell across them both, and the river moved below. When they broke apart, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. He pressed his forehead to hers again. She smiled. She couldn't not. It arrived without permission, that smile, small and private and completely honest. And she felt him feel it, the change in her face against his, the warmth of it, and something in him answered. She felt it in his hands, in the way they held her, the careful, almost wondering quality of it, like someone handling something they have been told their whole life they cannot have. Illy would have had opinions about this, she said quietly. She felt a sound in his chest, not quite a laugh, the ghost of one, surprised out of him. Favorable ones, I hope, he said. She thought about Illy, about his sharp, clear eyes and his understanding of the world's actual architecture, about what he would have seen in this man and what he would have said about it, late at night, with the city outside and 2 cups of coffee between them. He would have said, she said softly, that you have very good security instincts and questionable communication habits, and that you should listen to the people you love more than you currently do. The word love sat in the sentence where she had placed it, and neither of them moved. He was very still. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He would have been right. Dante said, his voice was quiet, careful, carrying something enormous in a very small space. She looked at him for a long moment, at everything he was, and everything he was still becoming, and the specific morning, light quality of a man standing on new ground, uncertain and unarmored and present. Yes, she said, he would have. She left the East Building at 8:30 in the morning. She walked, of course, she walked. The streets were quiet in the way that early Sunday mornings are quiet. The city not yet fully reconstituted, a brief amnesty between Saturday night and the rest of the week. The air was cool and smelled of rain and coffee from somewhere nearby, and the particular clean openness that comes after difficult things are resolved. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her footsteps unhurried, and she thought about the morning, and the room, and the river, and the specific weight of a man's heartbeat under her palm. She thought about what she had agreed to, which was not a small thing, which would not be a simple thing, which would ask of her a kind of courage that was different from the courage of throwing yourself in front of a bullet. That kind was fast, instinctive. The other kind was slow and sustained, and required the daily decision to remain open to something that could hurt you. She had made that decision. She was not afraid of it. She turned onto her block the familiar row of buildings. The corner store, the smell of someone's early breakfast drifting from a window, the ordinary, durable beauty of a life that was hers. Her phone rang. She answered. You walked, he said. I always walk. I know. A pause. I watched from the window until you turned the corner. She stopped on the sidewalk. She thought about him at that window, above the river, in the morning light, watching her go. She thought about what that meant from a man who kept everything at the perimeter, who had spent 18 years making sure nothing could reach him at the center. She was at the center. Dante, she said. Yes, I'll call you later. I know you will, he said. And something in the way he said it, the quiet certainty of it, the absence of the careful management that had characterized so much of his speech in these early weeks, the simple, clean fact of a man who believed what he was saying, made her close her eyes for a moment on the pavement of her own street with the morning around her. "Good," she said. She hung up. She looked up at the sky, pale blue and open, the kind that makes no promises but doesn't need to. She breathed the cool air. She thought about Ali briefly in the way she always thought about him. Not the grief of it, which was always there and always would be, but the presence of him. The specific quality of being known by someone who knew you entirely. She thought he would have laughed, probably, and then gone quiet, and then said something true. She walked to her door, fished her keys. She was almost inside when she stopped. Because something had occurred to her, small, specific. The kind of thing that surfaces in the aftermath of large events and announces itself with a particular quality of unfinished business. She stood at her door and held very still and let the thought complete itself. Howard Pell was gone. Straight was dealt with. The immediate threat was resolved. But Straight had not worked alone. He never had. There were structures beneath him, arrangements, alliances. The subterranean architecture of a world that did not simply dissolve because one man had been removed from it. And somewhere in that architecture, someone had given Straight the information about her apartment building. Someone who was not Straight, someone who might still be watching. She stood at her door for a moment longer. Then she went inside. She locked the door. She stood in the small hallway of her apartment with the morning coming through the kitchen window and her coat still on. And she held the thought and turned it over and looked at its shape. She took out her phone. She almost called him. She put the phone down. She made coffee. She was not going to call him with a half-formed question in the first hours of the morning after. She was not going to be someone who immediately, reflexively, turned every uncertainty toward him for resolution. That was not who she was, and it was not how she intended to operate in his life. She would think it through. She would form the specific question, and then she would ask it clearly and directly, and they would address it together. Together, the words sat in her mind with a weight she hadn't expected, and a warmth she was beginning to allow. She drank her coffee at the window. She watched her street wake up, the corner store opening, the first dog walker, a child on a bicycle wobbling with magnificent determination. The Sunday morning texture of a life that was hers, and was also now, in some specific and irreversible way, larger than it had been. She thought about a trigger click, about the split, second decision to place herself between a man and the thing aimed at him, about how she had not chosen it. Not really, the body had moved and the mind had followed. And by the time she had fully understood what she was doing, it was already done. She wondered now if the weeks since had been the same, the body knowing before the mind, the decision already made in some cellular, irreducible part of her, while the mind was still conducting its careful deliberations. Probably, she had always known, that was the truth of it, simple and slightly humbling. She had known in the restaurant, with the chaos around them and his hand on her wrist, and those dark eyes reading her without fear. She had known in the cafe by the river, and in the warehouse space with the candles, and in the East Building corridor with the card in her pocket. She had known every time she had relocated the thing in her chest, which was not relocation at all, but simply acknowledgement deferred. She had known, and she had placed herself between him and the danger with the same certainty both times. The bullet and the other thing. The thing that could hurt you worse and longer and in every direction. She set down her coffee cup. Outside, the child on the bicycle made a triumphant loop of the block, arms briefly out, balanced for one perfect moment. Her phone lit up, not a call, a message from him. 3 words. She looked at them for a long time. She set the phone face down on the table. She smiled. She did not reply, not yet. Because some things were worth making him wait for, this man who had never waited for anything in his life, who had always been the one that others waited on, who was sitting somewhere in the East, building right now with his phone in his hand and that unguarded expression she had learned and no one else had seen, waiting to find out what she would say. She would say it. She would say it fully and honestly and without qualification, the way she did everything. Just not yet. She picked up her coffee. She looked out at her street. She held the moment, this exact particular moment, the morning light and the quiet and the warmth in her chest, and the 3 words on the screen, and the open, unmarked quality of a day that had not yet decided what it would be. She breathed. And somewhere across the city, in a room above a river, a man who had not felt safe in 18 years sat with a phone in his hand and the ghost of a Sunday morning on his face, and waited.